Welcome, and it is such a pleasure to be here this evening. I was thrilled when Stacy shared with me the idea that she had for tonight, and I was honored when she asked me to participate, and I have been in awe of the level of enthusiasm and dedication that everyone involved has shown with respect to pulling this event together. So it really is an honor to be here, and I'm truly looking forward to what we will create tonight. I realize that time is of the essence and we're operating under the pressures of the clock, so I'm just going to jump right in here to the remarks that I have prepared for tonight. And we are here to discuss the issue of diversity and the responsibilities that come with it for schools and therefore for parents and educators. And so to get things started, I want to talk a little bit about how I define diversity, what that term means when I use it. Respecting the fact that there are probably a diverse number of opinions about how to define diversity. But mine would be the following, that I think of it as a broad, multi-dimensional concept that includes different dimensions, different sociological dimensions of reality. So it includes, but is certainly not limited to things like race, ethnicity, social class, gender, sexual orientation, religion, physical and mental ability, etc., etc. Tonight, we're going to talk about diversity, but we're going to punctuate two of these dimensions, specifically racial diversity and economic diversity. And I'm delighted that we're going to focus on race and class because I think that these are two of the most difficult issues to talk about, that they tend to engender a great deal of anxiety and volatility. And so we're much more likely to skirt around them rather than to dive right in and address them head on. And yet, that's exactly what we need to do. So I see tonight as a wonderful opportunity to do just that, and I welcome that. I mean, after all, race and class do structure all aspects of all of our lives. Everything from the quality of our health, to the neighborhoods that we live in, to the experiences that we get in schools around how we were either encouraged or discouraged, to the friends that we have, to the people that we date or marry, to our hopes and aspirations. All parts of these experiences are influenced in some way by our class and our race locations. So it's important that we take time to really consider those dimensions of diversity and how they structure our relationships in our lives. So when it comes to issues of diversity and responsibility, I think our first responsibility is to ensure that diversity is represented. And so this is certainly a wonderful community with respect to its commitment to the inclusion of diversity. I've certainly been involved in any number of school communities where that has not been the case. So this is a welcome experience for me. And it is important to have diversity represented because while children absolutely learn from books and computers and structured learning experiences, they also learn the most from their opportunities to interact socially. And so when we have the presence of diversity, and particularly racial diversity and economic diversity, there are opportunities to cross race and class borders and to interact with each other through differences is an invaluable life learning experience. And so that representation is essential. Now, once we have diversity represented, it does beg the question, what are our responsibilities with regard to diversity and how we address it? And so I think that there are any number of responsibilities, but I would boil them all down into one central goal that I think schools in particular need to focus on, and that is how to create what I, for lack of a better term, refer to as proactive diversity cultures. And I mean proactive rather than reactive, because all too often what happens is that our attention to diversity is reactive and not proactive. And what I mean by that is, for many schools, the only time that they really devote serious attention to addressing diversity is when there's a problem. And then they bring in the experts, and then they've got the consultants, and the diversity trainings, and all of that stuff, blah, 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 blah. But that's reactive, and I think it's much more effective to take a proactive approach. And a proactive diversity culture is defined by several characteristics. The first of these is that we openly acknowledge and address and attend to diversity on a regular basis. So it becomes just a part of how we do business. It's a part of how we talk. It's a part of how we understand meaning. It's a part of how we deconstruct what's occurring in a classroom. It's integrated throughout the curriculum. It's part of our approaches to teaching and learning. It's part of the climate in the school. That is a part and parcel of everything that happens. It's not just a unit or a lesson or a day or an event. It's interwoven throughout everything. A second characteristic that I think defines a pro-diversity culture, a proactive diversity culture, is that we have a respect and valuation for differences. Now this one is tricky because we all like to believe in principle that we include diversity and we respect differences, but actually acting on it is another story. So I can't tell you the number of times that I've been hired by a university that said to me, we want difference, we want diversity. Come here and help contribute to our diversity. And I do, and then the first thing that happens is as soon as I express an opinion that differs from the opinions of those in power, then I'm punished. So that's one of the challenges that we face around creating proactive diversity cultures, is that we really have to walk the walk and not just talk the talk, so that there has to be space for different opinions, different ways of doing, different ways of being, to all sit at the table. That doesn't mean we have to like it all. We just have to create space for it all and recognize that it's all of equal value. And then the third characteristic that I think defines a proactive diversity culture is that we teach kids how to handle differences in effective ways. That we give them actual skills for negotiating their differences, that they can then use for the rest of their lives for how to translate. They can translate into all of their experiences in lives well beyond their classrooms that they learn these experiences in. And so we have to take proactive steps to teach those kinds of skills to kids. And I think when we have the presence of these things, that's what a proactive diversity culture looks like. Now, that would of course lead to the question, okay, that sounds wonderful, Tracey, but how do you create that? And I think that there are any number of steps and actions that schools and parents and educators and communities can take to foster that kind of a climate. But I want to talk a little bit first about what I think are some of the inherent challenges or barriers to doing just that. So I think one of the first potential barriers that we face with respect to creating this kind of climate is that we live in a society where there is this vast schism between our ideals on one hand and our practical realities on the other. And so an example of this would be that we all believe that honesty is the best policy, and yet every single one of us here in this room has lied and is going to lie again. And if there's anyone here in this room that has never told a lie, would that liar please identify themselves now? Another example of this would be that we believe in peace and we abhor violence. And yet, amazingly, we have been unable, in spite of the countless deaths of innocent people at the hands of gun violence, we still can't come up with any legislation to control guns. It's remarkable, right? Because we believe in peace, we abhor violence, we are inundated with gun violence, and yet we still can't figure out a way to control guns. So it's another one of those contradictions, our ideals, practical realities. Another one, of course, has to do with diversity. We love diversity. We think it's beautiful. We celebrate it. We want it. And yet, we reward sameness. In spite of the ways in which we say we value diversity, most of us date and marry intra-racially. Most of us live in communities, live in neighborhoods, have circles of friends of similar racial and class designations. So we love diversity, but we live in sameness. Many of us, not all, not everyone, certainly not people in this room. And then, of course, another example of this would have to do with this whole issue around equality, which is that we believe in equality. We believe all people are created equal, but that is not the world that we live in. To this day, it's still striking to me that women earn only 75 cents for every dollar that men earn. that a disproportionate number of people of color are represented among the poor. And that if you're poor in America, you're much more likely to die of the number one chronic illnesses. You're much more likely to die of heart disease, cancer, strokes, or diabetes if you're poor. So yes, we believe that all people are created in equality, but the reality of the world that we live in is that it's structured around a vast set of inequalities. And so these contradictions between what we believe and what we do constitute a barrier to creating these proactive diversity cultures. And so I think it's incumbent upon us to find ways to recognize the contradictions between the words we talk and the behaviors that we manifest, and to try to bridge that gap. So it starts with being open to that possibility, that maybe there's some disconnect between what I say and what I do. And I think from there, we then have the opportunity to critically evaluate our actions and hope to close that gap so there's greater congruence between what we say and what we do. Okay, so a second barrier that I think exists with respect to creating these proactive diversity cultures is that there are any number of mythologies that we cling to, which I think are highly problematic. And the first of these is the myth of colorblindness. It's this idea that we're a post-racial society right now. I don't see race and skin color. The truth is that we all see race and skin color. Now, what you do with what you see is a separate issue. And I suspect that why most of us try to claim that we don't see it is because we have some fear that if I say I see it, that then it will be assumed that I discriminate on the basis of it. But those are two separate things. So I find that it would be helpful if we could begin by at least acknowledging that yes, we all see race and skin color, and yes, how it influences us is something else altogether. Another mythology that we hold on to is that we are a classless society. So when we think about class, we like to think of that as something that exists in Great Britain or India, that we don't like to think of the U.S. as this class stratified society. And yet, we are highly class stratified. And all of us make class attributions every time we meet someone, whether consciously or unconsciously. We all make class assumptions, and those influence how we perceive that person, how we think about that person, and how we treat that person. Class is there all the time. It's woven into everything. An example that I often like to share about this was when I was a graduate student, Professor went and asked me to go with him to do a presentation that he was doing for the law school, and I had forgotten on that particular day that he had asked me to do this. So I was wearing my typical uniform, which was, at the time I was a graduate student, so I had limited resources, so I had very modest, slacks and a sweater. And my one suit was still hanging in the closet because I'd forgotten this was the day. Okay, so I went and I did the presentation, nothing I could do about it. So it was fascinating to me when afterwards one of the faculty came up and said, I just wanted to tell you that I really appreciate what you had to say, and you're so eloquent, and I was really impressed with your ideas, and I'm so embarrassed to admit to you that I didn't expect any of that from you. And it was the way you were dressed. I looked at that and I just thought that, there was something about what you were wearing. I just didn't expect that kind of intellect. Now that was a fascinating association because she was looking at my clothes and I believe she was making class attributions, which I challenged her about and she acknowledged. And then she recognized her own association between, if I was not solidly upper middle class, then I must not be intellectually competent. It was, she said, one of the most startling moments for her and humiliating, and it was incredibly revealing for me. So I always draw back to that story because it's just the subtle ways in which it's always there, whether we see it or not. And then this third mythology that I think we have, which is very dangerous, is that this is the land of equal opportunity. And it's this notion that we can all sort of pull ourselves ahead and make the American dream come true for ourselves. And while it's true that the United States is a wonderful country that offers many opportunities that you don't find in other countries, the reality is that the playing field is not level. and opportunities are not equal. So if you're a single mother who's working 40 hours a week at a minimum wage job, you do not have the same opportunities to pull yourself up by the bootstraps and manifest your American dream as someone who is already earning $80,000 a year, or comes from a family where there's generations of wealth, or has a partner who is able to sustain them economically while they pursue education or other entrepreneurial pursuits. So the playing field is not equal. And I think it's important that we dispel that mythology. The dispelling of those mythologies is a first step towards getting real about very hard issues. And that's a critical step in creating a proactive diversity culture. Okay, the third possible barrier to creating this kind of a climate is that we have a tendency, I think, in society to seek simplification. That it's very hard for us to resist reductionism, because we want things to be neat and simple and to fit into clean, orderly boxes and categories. And certainly technology has not helped this at all, because now we all want all of our information to be given and to be shared in sound bites and in 140-character tweets. So it just lends itself to this reduction of complexity into overly simplified formulas. And that's dangerous, because diversity is complicated. It's very complicated. And it takes time, it takes a lot of energy, and it's messy. And there's no simple, easy way to get through it. So I think our orientation towards simplification is a potential barrier that we have when it comes to taking these issues on in a really authentic and meaningful way. And then finally, I think another possible barrier that we face with regard to creating the kind of climate that fosters a proactive approach to diversity is that I think it's difficult for many of us to be uncomfortable, that we're not willing to be uncomfortable. And dealing with diversity is often really uncomfortable. That if we're really doing it honestly, if we're really talking about these issues in an authentic way, it's not comfortable. And if we're not willing to step outside of our comfort zones, to risk stepping on someone else's toes, to risk offending, to risk having someone get mad at us, to risk having to deal with really strong and intense emotions, then we're not going to have the kinds of difficult dialogues that are an essential part of engaging with diversity in a proactive and productive manner. So it's important to be willing to step outside those comfort zones, and I find that is particularly difficult when we have locations of privilege. So one of the things that, I work with therapists, and I've spent many years training therapists, and so one of the things that often comes up when I'm working with white therapists is that, when we try to have these conversations and supervision like around race, they will often say things to me like, I don't feel safe. That's why I can't talk about this stuff. I don't feel safe. And I often explain to them, well then welcome to what it's like to live to be a racial minority in this society. That your safety is part of your privilege. And the fact that you can choose to stay safe and comfortable is a privilege. Not everyone has that privilege. If you are located in a marginalized position, you don't feel safe most of the time. And you can't choose to be comfortable. And so I try to use my power to lose my power. And one way that we can do that is to step outside of our comfort zones and be willing to step into difficult conversations about very complex issues. Okay, so those are some of the barriers that we face. And those are some of the things that I think we need to point toward around negotiating around those barriers. I'm going to conclude my remarks here by pointing to several things, specific actions that I think that are important to take with respect to creating these proactive diversity cultures. And the first is that I think we need to recognize that if we have different contexts, we have different realities. So what your context is shapes your reality. Therefore, and everyone in this room has some experience. I'm guessing that almost everyone in this room has some location in a position of privilege and in positions of oppression. That it's never, again, to avoid simplistic either or thinking. I can't think of a person who is all oppressed or all privileged, who has never had some experience with both sides of that coin. And so when we have locations in experiences around privilege, sometimes it's helpful to think about what it's like when we're located in positions of marginalization and oppression, because sometimes that's the easiest way to try to understand, okay, I think I get what I need to try to do here to challenge myself. But from positions of privilege, the way this works is that the privileged know very little about the context and the realities of the oppressed, because they don't have to. Their survival isn't dependent on it. And for those who have experiences with oppression and marginalization, they have to know their own context and reality, and they have to know something about the context and the reality of those with privilege, because their survival depends on it. And so when I talk about knowing different contexts and knowing different realities, I'm really talking to our locations around privilege. So if you're privileged on the basis of race, or class, or sexual orientation, or religion, or mental and physical ability, whatever your location is around privilege, it would be really important for us as educators, as parents, as the adults in charge, to take some initiative to challenge ourselves to learn something else about other contexts and therefore other realities. I think that's something huge that we can do to push this along. And one of the things that I do, again, when I'm training therapists, is, like, I often teach a diversity class, and of course it's always the case that most of the students in that class are white, and many of them have experiences with economic privilege. So one of the ways that I try to encourage them to step outside of their comfort zone is, like, so I will tell the white students, you know what you need to do? You need to go down to a black church and just hang out for a service one day. It never ceases to amaze me the kind of paralysis that creates for so many students, because for the first time in their lives, many of them have found themselves in the only one position. And they realize, this is uncomfortable. Wow, this doesn't feel okay. So it's always a transformative experience. But until you step across racial borders and boundaries and put yourselves in those types of situations, it's difficult to understand the context and reality from another person's location, and specifically from a marginalized location. Another thing that I do with students is I have students who've had economic privilege and advantage go down to the Department of Social Services and go hang out at the welfare office and submit an application and see what that experience is like. And they are always mortified by A, how long it takes, how incredibly dehumanized they are there by the people who work there, how they feel like they are treated like second-class citizens. They said it's a shameful experience. And it has a profound effect because it helps them to understand something about the context and the reality that poor people have to endure on a regular basis. So these types of experiences around challenging ourselves to step into new spaces and get uncomfortable, I think, is a really important part around learning about different contexts and realities. Another thing that I think we can do is to know ourselves. And so I think it's critical that we ask ourselves questions like, how do I define myself racially? And how do I define my class location? And has my class location changed over the course of my lifetime? Because class is one of those interesting things. Like, while race can't change, class can. And while I have absolutely no empirical evidence for this, I am absolutely convinced that for most of us, the class that we are born into and raised in becomes our psychological class for a lifetime. So we may change our class locations over the course of our lives, but up here and in here, psychologically, the way we understand the world, the way we relate to it, is forever shaped by those early experiences with our class location growing up. And I think it's important that we ask ourselves, what were those experiences and how did they shape me? What was my class story? What did I learn in my family about race? What messages were conveyed overtly or covertly about class, about gender, about sexual orientation, about religion? What did my parents model for me? What experiences I had that influenced my current thoughts, feelings, perceptions, beliefs, biases, and triggers? Because knowing ourselves is the greatest tool that we have at our disposal. It's also not knowing ourselves as our greatest liability, but the more we know ourselves, better prepared we are to understand how what we're bringing to the table is influencing interaction, and particularly when we're working with kids who are so vulnerable and impressionable. I think we have an absolute responsibility to understand ourselves and to know how our prejudices, our beliefs, our experiences, our biases, and our triggers are shaping and informing what we see and what we don't see, what we do and what we choose not to do. So knowing ourselves is essential. Third, I think we have to be willing to engage in difficult dialogue, and that means having a willingness to talk about race, about class, about gender, about sexual orientation, around all of these dimensions of diversity in ways that are real. And when I say real, this is what I mean. That if we're talking across diversity lines, and that's the way that we should do difficult dialogues, then there are different ways that those who have privilege and those who are oppressed need to enter the transaction. And I think when we're sitting in a privileged location, then part of our responsibility is to be able to listen and to hear and to acknowledge and to be accountable. To be able to own the privileges that we've had, whether we wanted them or not, we've got them. And to be able to be honest about the impact that they have on the lives of others and our role in that, whether we wish to have it or not, we do. And if we're operating from positions of marginalization or oppression, then I think our responsibility is to express, to speak the truth, to tell it like it is, and to not jump in to take care of the privileged, to make them feel better, to hold them accountable, as awkward and as strained as that can feel. That's part of having a difficult dialogue. And I think the more we can do that in our everyday lives with the people that we work with the people in our families, with the people that we meet, wherever we go, the more we can infuse that into everyday living, then I think we are primarily positioned to create what I would call these proactive diversity cultures. So I think that should conclude my remarks for tonight, and I really look forward to any questions or comments that you have, and I hope that in the context of this evening that we will in fact shape it up and that the temperature in the room will rise a little, because I don't know, we're really getting somewhere. Thank you.